My stomach hurt from the moment I stepped through the doors of St. Andrew's Catholic School. I lived in a state of constant panic, the Our Lady of Perpetual Adrenaline Rush. My fingers shook, my breathing was rapid and shallow. I felt sweaty all the time. My bully was tall and thin with a perfect brown bob. She wore slacks and a navy sweater with a Peter Pan collar and a tiny gold crucifix that laid on her sternum. I couldn't escape my bully. She was my fourth grade teacher. Her name was Sister Sharon. My 9-year-old self had no idea that the bully nun was a stereotype. I hadn't been exposed to the trope of rulers on knuckles. My mom had mentioned Catholic school, but she clammed up whenever I talked to her about it. Before, in my elementary school, we had one nun, the principal, Sister Jovita. She was thoughtful yet feisty, gray-haired. She still wore a habit and once pulled me out of class just to give me a hug. Nuns in my limited exposure were about love, God, and hugs. As 9-year-olds go, I was awkward. Not just regular awkward, but the kind of earnestness that's reserved for rare, naive hearts. I was the kind of awkward that noticed a girl in my class had the softest hands I ever felt and gushed to her about it. Sure, that's weird. But it didn't stop there. I started calling her Soft Skin as a nickname. Ignorant of how Buffalo Bill, she puts the lotion in the basket weird that is. That's a toe curling level of awkward. I was also a scholarship kid from an entirely different part of town. A class system existed in our school and I was aware of it. So when a nun started humiliating me and berating me in front of my entire class, I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents, not the school. Sister Sharon's classroom worked on a demerit system. A demerit was a sheet mimeographed in purple ink that listed the date, the name of the student, and the infraction. You had to take demerits home to be signed, and you had 48 hours to return them, or they doubled. 5 demerits, after-school detention. 10, in-school suspension. I got demerits for everything. For talking, not paying attention, laughing too loud. Most of the time, I got demerits for forgetting my homework, and I was incredibly forgetful. Scholarship kids arrived at St. Andrew's way before the other students or staff arrived, so they unlocked a classroom and cordoned us off until homeroom. They didn't even flip over the chairs from the nightly janitor work, and none of us were brave enough to do that without permission. We stood on the high glass floors, swaying back and forth in silence or whispering each other, waiting for the 45 minutes for the first bell to ring. Once, my book bag snagged one of these upside-down chairs, knocking it to the floor in a loud clang that reverberated down the hallways. We all froze. Sister Sharon was there lightning fast, grabbing me by the ear. She dragged me to sit in the principal's office. I got a demerit for horseplay and another demerit for being tardy for homeroom because I was in the principal's office. My parents couldn't understand how I was getting into so much trouble. My dad turned every demerit into a lecture on how irresponsible and careless I was with my parochial education. Not even my mother could save me every day from every demerit. My father, in a fit of brilliance, decided that if I was always forgetting my homework, he'd make me wear a small memo pad on a hardware store-style chain around my neck to write my homework assignments. This humiliation only added to my social awkwardness, and I still forgot to bring my books home. Demerit. Sister Sharon would yell at me, insult me, call me dumb or insubordinate. She'd mockingly tell me how shocked she was to be writing my name down yet again. But it wasn't just her. I could picture my parents later that night standing at the kitchen table looking incredulous and disappointed. I'd sit at my desk silently sobbing, not saying anything, praying to be a better person. I got demerits for crying over demerits. It would be years before I understood the word bully and all its connotations. Even if I had known, my 9-year-old self would just have thought that I deserved it. I thought I was bad, Catholic level bad. That year, we went to confessional for the first time. Second in line for confessional, I told the priest everything. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. This is my first confession. I told him how I forgot my homework, how I fought with my little sister, how I tried to be good, but I wasn't. He was charming and sweet, and he listened and he made jokes about how hard I was on myself. I felt so good, light. This was a fresh start. But when I left the confessional, Sister Sharon grabbed me, her fingers digging in, and shoved me into a pew. By her eyes, I knew I'd done something wrong, but what? Later, she said through clenched teeth, "You were in confessional for too long. Demerit." I had in-school suspension on a regular basis. It actually wasn't too bad. The room they put me in was this tiny attic space in the tower. A window faced the church, and I spent a lot of time seeing if I could get gum to stick to it. I finished all my work within the first hour and spent the rest of the time drawing and reading. The only time I regretted being in the tower was when my class would march past for lunch and Sister Sharon would conveniently forget me. But I wouldn't say a word, knowing that another demerit would just itch in the palm of her hand, and if I left the room without permission, I'd have another. But I was hungry and lonely. The idea that this treatment was unfair flickered in my mind whenever she gave me a demerit. I'd feel a protest rising in my throat, but I'd squelch it. The scholarship kids were here as a favor. I could be thrown out at any time. It wasn't like I belonged there. They were just trying to save me from myself. And I couldn't let down my mom and dad. Just be quiet and be better. Do better. Sister Sharon kept track of demerits on a white desk calendar. She entered my name on the day I received the demerit and would write down the date when I returned it signed by a parent. Demerits doubled every day when they weren't returned. I had just gotten a demerit for asking Angela what page we were on in our phonics workbook. I was just trying to make sure I was in the right spot, and this was my 10th demerit. I would be in the tower again, and I just didn't want to go. I felt the corner of my mouth tug down in an involuntary frown, a prelude to me crying. Don't cry, don't be a baby, you'll just get another demerit. But I only frowned more. She flipped the calendar back and forth, letting out short, every couple of seconds. Then she looked up with me with a smile. It seems, Jessica, that you have a significantly overdue demerit, one that should have been returned at least 3 weeks ago. Do you have that demerit? I stammered and picked up my book bag and looked through it. I had wads of paper scrunched up at the bottom of my bag. I tried unrolling them, and I knew I hadn't gotten it signed. I don't know. It is your responsibility, Jessica. If you don't have them, it's your own fault. It is not my job to remind you, to keep on you, to check in with you every day. It is your responsibility. And if you forgot, you must pay the the consequences. Her smiling face turned stern as she sat down with her calculator. She punched in numbers and then in cursive blue ink wrote out a demerit. I went easy on you. Only counted it for 10 days overdue instead of the full 21. I did you a favor, Jessica. She handed it to me. The small piece of paper curled under her meticulous handwriting. It said 1,024 demerits. 1,024 demerits. How many days of in-school suspension would that be? How many times did 10 go into 1,000? If 10 went into 100, would they finally kick me out? Could I be kicked out for an overdue demerit? Sister Sharon clucked her tongue. Oh, you're not going to start crying again, are you? I knew if I blinked, the tears would run down my face. I didn't look up. I knew everyone was looking at me, staring at the girl with 1,024 demerits. I could hear whispers already. I wish I could be noble and stoic and not be the girl who always cries. For someone who is on scholarship, I feel like you're taking advantage of everyone's generosity. My skin felt hot, and inside something was building, and I was trying to push it down, but it just kept rising. And I looked at the demerit, and I thought about the kitchen table, and I thought about my parents' faces, and how would I explain this to my mother? This wasn't one demerit. This was 1,024 demerits. There was probably no other kid at St. Andrews that ever received 1,024 demerits. My mother would have to tell my father. You brought this on yourself, Jessica. But it was a mistake. I didn't do anything. It wasn't my fault. I was trying every day. I try so hard, and I'm never good enough. Tears and snot streamed down my face, but I was no longer crying because I wasn't good enough. I was crying because of how wholly unfair it was. Why are you even a teacher if you don't like kids? I was standing, screaming at her. I jumped, not recognizing my own voice. She turned around, her mouth wide open. Why do you hate me so much? What did I ever do to you to make me hate me so much? Aren't you a nun? Aren't you supposed to love everybody? If you hate teaching and you hate kids, can't you do something else? I am not a bad person. You are a bad person. I ran out of the room and to the bathroom. I sobbed loudly, the cries echoing off the tile walls. I splashed water in my face, crying more, but also smiling because it felt so good. Good and terrible, because yelling at a nun isn't good. But standing up for myself felt so much better than I thought it could. The girls in my class filed into the restroom, a break after the scene I created. I wasn't looking at them. I continued to sob and try to wash my face. But then there were these gentle pats on my back and whispers in my ear. Good job. Wow. That was amazing. It made me happy all over again. Angie whispered, Sister Sharon says you have to go to the principal's office. In the principal's office, they were already whispering about me. My mother was called, and she was on her way. I didn't speak to anyone. I sat and waited. I imagined how mad my mother must have been when they called her. What did they tell her? She didn't get to hear my side of the story at all. So unfair. Her station wagon pulled up. She didn't even get out of the car. My shoulders sank and I slowly plodded down the sidewalk. The sun was shining so bright that I couldn't look up. I just watched my feet take me to my doom. I pulled the handle on the car door and slid into the passenger seat. Without glancing up, I put on my seatbelt. I fixed my gaze at the vents on the dashboard, memorizing the dust. I didn't think I had any more tears in me, but just in case, I was willing myself to just concentrate on the dashboard until the yelling stopped. I waited. There was just silence. The anticipation made it worse, but I refused to look at her because I knew I would just start crying. Finally, she started the car, and I heard her take a long, deep breath and exhale slowly. I have always wanted to tell off a nun. I looked over at her, and she smiled, patted my leg, and we drove home.
Jessica Hilt, ladies and gentlemen.